On the morning of September 5th, 1932, a butler named John Carmichael walked into a house on Easton Drive in Benedict Canyon and found his employer dead on the floor. He did not call the police. He called Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The body was found at about 11:30. By 1:45, studio executives were in the house. At least an hour passed after that before anyone told the police. Some accounts put the total closer to 2 hours. The dead man was Paul Byrne. He was 42, an MGM producer, Irving Thalberg's right hand, and he had been married for 2 months to Jean Harlow, who was 21 and the most valuable asset that studio owned. He was, by every account, one of the most liked men in Hollywood. Born Paul Levy in Hamburg, cultured, quiet, generous with young performers. They called him Hollywood's father confessor because he was the executive stars went to with their private disasters, and he was known to keep them private. He had also personally persuaded MGM to buy Jean Harlow's contract from Howard Hughes, which is the move that turned her into a star. He built her. Then he married her. 2 months later, he was on a floor in Benedict Canyon, and his employer was standing over him. Louis B. Mayer was in that house before the state of California knew there was a body in it. And here is the fact that should be the most famous thing about Louis B. Mayer, and somehow isn't. The suicide note, the document that determined the verdict, that explained the death, that closed the case, was produced by Mayer. He said he had found it in the home. Read that again, slowly. A man died. The studio arrived first. The studio's chief executive personally produced the piece of paper that established what had happened. And only then were the police invited in to examine a scene that 4 studio employees had already been walking around in for an hour. The note read, "Dearest dear, unfortunately, this is the only way to make good the frightful wrong I have done you and wipe out my abject humiliation. I love you, Paul." And underneath, a line that has never been explained by anybody. You understand, last night was only a comedy. It was undated. Doubts have persisted ever since about whether it was in his handwriting at all, and about whether it was a suicide note or an apology written weeks earlier about something else entirely. And consider the position that puts the police in when they finally arrive. They walk into a house where 4 men from the largest corporation in the county have been moving around for an hour or more. The scene they examine is not the scene that existed at 11:30. It is a scene that has been in the custody of interested parties, and every conclusion they reach afterwards rests on it. No detective in the world solves a case under those conditions. They didn't either. The coroner's jury sat the following day. On September 6th, 1932, they ruled it a self-inflicted death with the motive undetermined. 24 hours. 1 day between a body on a floor and a closed file. Now the part that makes the whole thing worse. Byrne had a former common-law wife, Dorothy Millette, whom he had been with from 1911 to 1920 and continued to support financially. Almost nobody in Hollywood knew she existed. Days after Byrne's death, Millette checked into a Sacramento hotel under a false name. She boarded a riverboat. Her body was pulled from the Sacramento River. 2 people connected to that house were dead inside a week, and one of them was a woman nobody at the studio had ever mentioned in public. And Millette's existence is itself a piece of evidence about how this industry worked, because Byrne was a senior executive at the largest studio in the world, marrying its biggest star in a wedding the publicity department arranged, and there was a woman with a decade-long claim on him whom nobody had surfaced. Either the studio didn't know, which seems unlikely given what that department did for a living, or it knew and had decided she was not going to be a problem. Samuel Marks, MGM's own story editor, a man who was actually at the house that day, became convinced Byrne had been killed by Millette, and said so in a book decades later. Ben Hecht, the screenwriter, said the same thing. So what are the possibilities? 1. Exactly what the file says. A man in genuine distress, 2 months into a marriage, ended his own life and left a note. 2. Millett killed him. That's the theory Samuel Marks held and Ben Hecht held, and it has the advantage of explaining why a woman with a claim on him drowned in a river within days. 3. Something happened in that house that involved neither of them, and the studio decided the cheapest available story was the one that involved nobody else. And 4, which nobody likes, and which is probably closest to the truth. The studio arrived, saw a situation that could destroy a 21-year-old actress at the peak of her earning power, and arranged the room into the version that did the least commercial damage, without necessarily knowing themselves what had actually occurred. That last one isn't murder. It's worse in a different way because it means the answer was never established by anybody, including them. I'm not going to tell you which it was because nobody knows, and anybody who claims otherwise is selling something. But notice that the evidence for all 4 is compromised in exactly the same way, for one obvious reason. The evidence is compromised because the men who controlled it worked for the man whose company the answer belonged to. That is the whole story of Louis B. Mayer, and it is not really about a marriage or a scandal or a note. It's about who arrives first. That is the entire product, not the films, not the stars. The capacity to reach the facts before anybody with authority does, and to decide what they will be. There was other testimony, incidentally, that didn't fit and didn't survive. At the inquest, the couple's gardener said he had never once heard Byrne raise the subject of suicide, and that the marriage was not the affectionate one the studio and Harlow wanted the public to believe in. That is a household employee, under oath, contradicting the official account of both the death and the marriage, and it changed nothing, because by then the note existed, and Mayer had produced it. In 1960, the Los Angeles District Attorney reopened the case and re-interviewed the household staff, 28 years later. No new evidence surfaced, and the verdict stood. Think about what it means that a district attorney went back to it after nearly 3 decades. It means the original file was never persuasive to anybody who read it properly. And there's one more thing about the physical scene that has never been resolved and that everybody who has looked at this comes back to. There were details in that house on the morning of September 5th that did not fit a man alone, glasses and a bathing suit that was not the right size for the woman who lived there. Those details come to us through people who were in the house before the police, which means they reach us through exactly the channel that cannot be trusted. That is the loop this case never escapes. Every scrap of evidence about the scene was handled by parties with a commercial interest in the conclusion. Jean Harlow never spoke publicly about it again. She was interviewed by detectives and appeared before a grand jury, and then said nothing about her husband's death for the rest of her life, which lasted 5 more years. She died of kidney failure in 1937 at 26. So who exactly was in the house? Eddie Mannix, MGM's general manager, Howard Strickling, who ran publicity, Whitey Hendry, the head of studio police. And the reason a film studio had a head of police in 1932 is that MGM operated its own force, and Hendry had previously been the actual police chief of Culver City, which is the town the studio was in. Sit with that arrangement for a second. The chief of police of the town resigned to go and run security for the largest employer in it, and the men who replaced him at the department were his former colleagues. Culver City in 1932 had a population in the low thousands in one industry. MGM was the tax base, the payroll, and the reason the town existed in the form it did. The relationship between the studio and the municipal authorities was not corrupt in the sense of envelopes changing hands. It was structural. The studio was the town. That is why the butler called the studio instead of the authorities. It wasn't loyalty and it wasn't panic. He called the organization that actually had jurisdiction. Mannix and Strickling ran what everyone in Hollywood called the fixers department, and it was a real department with a real budget reporting to the top of the company. Arrests, crashes, debts, blackmail, pregnancies, anything that could reach a newspaper, and the mechanism was mostly economic rather than violent, which is the part people romanticize wrongly. The studios bought colossal quantities of advertising, and the columnists depended on studio access to exist, so a story could simply be traded away. You give me this one, I'll give you that one. Every major studio had this function. MGM's was the best, and it ran for decades. There is a version of this that gets told fondly, the colorful old fixers, the cigars, the phone calls at 3 in the morning. It's a staple of Hollywood nostalgia, and there are films about it. Strip the affection out and describe it plainly. A private corporation employed men whose full-time salaried job was to reach the scene of an incident before the state did, and to determine what the public record of that incident would say. Not to lie to journalists afterwards, to arrive first. What that produces over 27 years is an information environment where the studio decides what happened before the state gets a look, and the record we have now, 94 years later, is the record they left, which is the difficulty with the entire subject of Louis B. Mayer. There is no court case, there is no deposition, there is no lawsuit, no indictment, no settlement, no sworn testimony against him by anybody. People sometimes assume there must be, given what circulates about him, and there isn't. But that absence is not evidence that nothing happened. It's the product. It's what the department was for. He built a company where things did not reach paper, and then he left no papers of his own. And the result is that a man who ran the largest studio on Earth for 27 years is one of the thinnest figures of his era in the documentary record. Compare that with a modern case. The reason we know what we know about Harvey Weinstein is that women testified, prosecutors filed, and documents entered a court. That machinery existed. It was slow, and it failed for decades, but it existed. None of it existed in 1932. No employment law that covered this, no union with jurisdiction, no press independent of studio advertising, no police force in that town that wasn't intertwined with the studio, no journalist who could survive losing access. So the comparison people reach for is the wrong shape. It isn't that Mayer was a version of a modern figure who got away with it. It's that the entire apparatus that eventually catches such people had not been built yet, and he was one of the men making sure it wasn't. Subscribe if this is the kind of thing you want more of. Now, the things that did reach paper. In 1934, Mayer proposed marriage to a 23-year-old contract player at his own studio. He was 50. He had been married for 30 years, and his wife was living in his house in Santa Monica. The woman was Jean Howard, out of the last Ziegfeld Follies, and newly signed to MGM. Mayer fell in love with her and proposed marriage, despite his reputation as a staunch family man. She refused, and in August 1934, married a young agent called Charles Feldman instead. Mayer banned Feldman from the MGM lot, and then refused to hire any of Feldman's clients at all. Every actor, writer, and director represented by Charles Feldman became, overnight, unemployable at the richest studio in the world. Not for anything they'd done, because their agent's wife had said no, and none of them would have been told. There was no rule written down and no policy announced. An actor whose name kept not appearing on casting lists, a writer whose scripts kept coming back. Somewhere in that building, a name simply meant no for years. That's the shape of the man, and it's the same shape as the house on Easton Drive. Nothing said, nothing written, an outcome, arranged. Feldman survived it, which is the only reason this story exists. He became the biggest talent broker in town and later produced a streetcar named Desire. Had he not survived it, there would be no anecdote, just an agent nobody has heard of and no way of knowing why. That's worth holding on to because it means the Feldman ban is not the only one. It's the one where the target happened to be strong enough to leave a trace. The actress Esther Ralston, a real star of the silent era, said for the rest of her life that she refused Mayer, that her contract was canceled, and that her career ended. Small parts at minor studios, then nothing. That's her own account in her own memoir, and Mayer isn't here to answer it, so weigh it accordingly. What makes it credible is that it's identical in structure to the Feldman Band. And you have to understand what a studio head asking an actress to dinner actually was in 1934. He held her 7-year contract. He decided what she was cast in, what she was paid, whether she was loaned out, whether she was suspended, and, through the morals clause, whether she was employable anywhere at all. There was no HR department. The actors' union didn't exist until 1933 and had no jurisdiction over this. The press was fed by the studio. The police were, in the most literal municipal sense, partly the studios. There was nobody to tell. That is not a figure of speech. Then there's his wife. Margaret Schenberg married Lazar Meir in 1904, when he was nobody, in the scrap trade in Boston. She was there through the Nickelodeons, the move to California, the founding of MGM, the entire ascent. 2 daughters, 43 years. In the 1940s, her health broke down. In 1947, he divorced her at a reported cost of several $1 million, one of the largest settlements in American history at the time. In 1948, he married Lorena Layson, a widow, considerably younger. Marriages end and divorce isn't a scandal. What's worth stating is the sequence. 43 years, ended after her health failed, remarried inside 12 months, by the man who had spent 2 decades presenting himself as the guardian of the American family and personally backing the censorship regime that policed how marriage could be depicted on screen. He was doing that in the same years, and the uncomfortable part is that he doesn't appear to have experienced it as hypocrisy. There's no evidence he thought of himself as leading a double life at all. Men who can hold those 2 things at once without strain are considerably more dangerous than men who know they're lying. Now the crying, because it's the mechanism underneath everything above. Almost every first-hand account of being in a room with Louis B. Mayer arrives at the same detail eventually. Agents, writers, actors, directors, his own executives. He wept. He talked about his mother. He would sink onto the carpet. On several documented occasions, he appeared to be having a heart attack in the middle of a salary negotiation. And the person who'd come in to ask for a raise ended up on their knees helping a 50-year-old man off the floor and apologizing. It's always told as a colorful anecdote. It shouldn't be. He had discovered that a person confronted with what appears to be overwhelming, genuine distress will abandon a position they walked in fully prepared to hold. That isn't a temperament. A temperament is a failure of control. This was control, performed as its opposite, and it switched off, which is how you know. The people who witnessed the collapses also described the recovery. The tears stopped when the meeting stopped. He could go from the floor to a lunch order in under a minute. More than one person who worked closely with him said the same thing in different words, that he was a superb actor who'd ended up on the wrong side of the camera, and that the finest performances of the MGM era were given in his office. The Gene Howard business, though, appears to have been real. Whatever he performed in negotiations, that one seems to have genuinely damaged him, and the vengeance he took on Feldman ran for years, longer than any calculated business grudge needs to run. So the technique wasn't invented, it was harvested. He had the real thing, worked out what it could do in a negotiation, and pointed it at people who owed him money. Which brings us to March 1933, and the largest audience he ever performed it for. Roosevelt declares the bank holiday. The bank's shut. The studios say they can't make payroll and propose an 8-week 50% pay cut across everybody. Mayer walks onto a soundstage at MGM and asks his employees to accept it, in person. Hundreds of them standing there. Every account agrees on the content. He talked about the family, shared sacrifice, what it would do to him personally if the company he loved couldn't survive. Lionel Barrymore stood and spoke in support. Mayer cried, and much of the room cried with him, and they took the cut, and some of them thanked him for it. Think about who was standing on that stage in March 1933. A quarter of the American workforce had no job at all. Every electrician and secretary and extra in that room knew exactly what was outside the gate. These were not people with options, and the studio knew it. That's not cynicism about Mayer's sincerity. He may well have meant every word. It's an observation about the room. You cannot get informed consent from an audience that believes refusing you means the breadline, and the man at the front of that soundstage had spent his entire career reading rooms for a living. And it emerged afterwards that the cut hadn't fallen evenly. The executives were substantially protected by structure or timing or arrangement. The people at the bottom took the full 50%, and the crisis eased considerably faster than 8 weeks. One caveat, because the popular version overstates this. The pay cut wasn't Mayer's invention alone. It was industry-wide. The banks really were shut. There was a genuine cash crisis. Several studios did it, and some of the money was repaid. The claim that he manufactured the emergency to rob his staff goes further than the evidence supports. That isn't the charge. The charge is what happened 19 months later, October 1934. California is choosing a governor, and the Democratic candidate is Upton Sinclair, 56, the man whose novel The Jungle got the meatpacking industry regulated, running on a program to hand idle land and idle factories to the unemployed as cooperatives. He'd swept the primary in August. Hundreds of local clubs, enormously popular in the 5th year of the Depression. Mayer, at that point, had been chairman of the California Republican Party. The studios threatened to move production to Florida, and they deducted money from their employees' paychecks to finance the campaign of Sinclair's opponent, Frank Merriam. Read that twice. They took money out of the wages of the people who worked for them, without asking, and gave it to a candidate the bosses preferred. Carpenters, electricians, secretaries, extras, a day's pay from everybody on the lot. 20 months after he stood on a soundstage and cried them out of half their salary. But the money still isn't the worst of it. Irving Thalberg, the sensitive one, the artist among the moneymen, commissioned 3 short films. He had a screenwriter, Carrie Wilson, manage and narrate them, and an MGM film test director shoot them. They were called California Election News. They opened with a map of the state and the strains of California, Here I Come. And a narrator introduced himself as the inquiring cameraman who stopped people in the street. They went into hundreds of theaters across the state, and MGM's name appeared nowhere on them. They carried no credits at all, which, in an industry that credited everything, was almost certainly a first. They looked like newsreels. They were not newsreels. There was no television in 1934. If you wanted moving pictures of anything happening in the world, you went to a cinema and watched the newsreel before the feature. And the newsreel was understood to be journalism. It had a house style, a narrator, a particular kind of music. People trusted the format because they had no reason not to. California Election News copied that format exactly, stripped the credits, and filled it with people selected, and by some accounts coached, to make one side look like fools. The Merriam supporters were portrayed as upstanding citizens. Many of the Sinclair supporters appeared poor or shabbily dressed. One gap-toothed man announced he was voting for Upton St. Clair. Another, heavily accented, explained that Sinclair was the author of the Russian government and it had worked out very well there. That isn't a political advertisement. Nobody had invented the political advertisement yet. It's a counterfeit of the news. Hearst and Harry Chandler pointed their newspapers at Sinclair simultaneously, which meant the Examiner, the Times, and effectively every cinema in California were running the same operation at once. Merriam won by about 250,000 votes. Sinclair still took 879,000, twice as many as any Democrat had ever taken in a California governor's race. And 24 candidates on his platform won legislative seats. Afterwards, at a party in Beverly Hills, some guests were complaining about the fake newsreels. Thalberg announced that he'd made them. Frederick March said it had been a dirty trick. Thalberg said nothing is unfair in politics. And notice the method, because by now it should be familiar. Something that looks like the real thing. Source concealed, deployed, so that the real thing becomes unnecessary. He did it 3 times. The fake newsreel in 1934, the fake union, the screen playwrights, a friendly outfit of well-paid writers the studios recognized and negotiated with while refusing to deal with the actual Screenwriters Guild, which took a federal labor board election in 1938 to settle. And in 1927, the biggest one. Weeks after the crafts unions won recognition in November 1926, Mayer spearheaded an effort to avert further unionization, specifically of the groups not yet organized, meaning writers, directors, and actors. He met with Fred Beatson of the Producers Association, the MGM contract actor Conrad Nagel, and the MGM director Fred Niblo. 2 of the 3 other men in that founding conversation were on his payroll. 36 people were invited to a banquet at the Ambassador Hotel. Membership open only to 5 branches: actors, directors, writers, technicians, producers. Stated aims: handling labor disputes, promoting harmony between branches, improving the industry's public image. A union puts employees on one side and the employer on the other. This put them in the same building, in separate branches, under producers, with membership offered as an honor rather than a right. Then, in 1929, it started handing out statues, which wasn't in the original plan at all. Mayer's own explanation: the best way to handle them was to hang medals all over them. If he got them cups and awards, they'd kill themselves to produce what he wanted. That is the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. It failed at the job, incidentally. It was never an effective arbiter and abandoned labor negotiations by 1937, because the actors and writers worked out what it was and left. The Screen Actors Guild was founded in 1933, in significant part by people who had just watched him cry them out of half their wages. His greatest performance created the organization he'd built the Academy to prevent. The Academy is still there, 99 years, a museum, a broadcast, more money than any of the guilds. There's Thalberg, too, and it belongs here because it's the same instinct as everything else. Irving Thalberg was MGM's head of production, and by common consent, the most gifted producer of the era. And he was born with a badly damaged heart, and everyone knew he wasn't expected to live long. He and Mayer were close, genuinely something near father and son, and they'd been fighting for years over Thalberg's share of the profits. Late 1932, weeks after the Bern business, Thalberg had a serious heart attack and went to Europe to recover. While he was gone, Mayer restructured the studio. Thalberg's authority over production was broken up and distributed among producers reporting to Mayer, one of them Mayer's own son-in-law. Thalberg came back to find the job he'd left no longer existed, and he was never head of production again. The restructuring is defensible. A studio can't leave its most critical function vacant indefinitely. It's the timing. The largest reduction in Irving Thalberg's power at MGM was executed while he was out of the country recovering from a heart attack by a man who called him a son. He died in 1936 at 37. Mayer's grief was enormous and by every account entirely genuine. He wept at the funeral. The Academy created a memorial award in Thalberg's name, which Mayer supported and which is still handed out. Both of those are true, and there's no evidence he ever experienced them as being in conflict for a second. Everything ends the same way, though, and the ending was built into the structure in 1924. MGM was a production subsidiary of Loews Incorporated, a New York theater chain. Loews owned the studio. After Marcus Loew died in 1927, it was run by Nicholas Schenck from an office in New York, and Schenck was Louis B. Mayer's boss. Mayer hired, fired, greenlit, shelved, and set the culture of the most powerful film company on earth. He owned none of it. Through the late 30s, his compensation made him the highest-paid individual in the United States, not in Hollywood, in the country, at over $1 million a year, with the Treasury publishing the figures in the newspapers. Highest-paid employee in America. In 1948, Lowe's installed Dor Sherry as head of production, and the two men disagreed about essentially every film in the building. In 1951, Mayer did the thing that had worked for 25 years. He went over the head of the man in front of him to New York and delivered an ultimatum. Sherry goes or I go. Schenck chose Sherry. June 22, 1951. The M in MGM was his name, and he wasn't allowed in the building. The technique didn't work because it couldn't. The tears, the collapse, the family, the loyalty, all of it had always worked on people who were in the room with him and who were employees too. Schenck was neither. He was in New York, he owned the company, and he was looking at a profit line that had gone the wrong way for 4 years. Mayer had arranged his own position on precisely the terms he'd spent his career imposing on everybody else. No ownership, no contract that couldn't be ended, nothing to appeal to. He spent his last 6 years trying to get back in, proxy fights, attempts to turn Lowe's shareholders against the board. Some accounts have him still working on one during his final illness. It went nowhere because a proxy fight is an argument about who owns the shares. He died on October 29, 1957, of leukemia at 73. He left no memoir, no diaries, no significant private papers, and the house on Easton Drive was sold and the files stayed closed after 1960, and Whitey Hendry and Eddie Mannix and Howard Strickling all died without ever giving a public account of what they saw when they walked into that room ahead of the police. There are stories about deathbed confessions. There always are. None of them are documented, and none of them changed anything. What is documented is the hour. Body found at 11:30. Studio in the house by 1:15. Police told later. That's the whole of Louis B. Mayer. And it isn't really about a note or a marriage or a governor's race. He got there first. Every time. And the one occasion he didn't, the one room he wasn't in, 3,000 miles away in New York in June 1951, is the one that ended him.